Hi everybody and welcome to a new exciting mini-series called How to Read AI Audio Research Papers Like a Rockstar. The ability to read and understand AI audio papers is of paramount importance to become an effective AI audio researcher or engineer. And the reason why that's the case is because only by reading and understanding papers you can really get in touch with the new ideas in the community and with the new concepts, new architectures, and all of this kind of stuff. So you really want to be able to read these papers. But unfortunately, reading papers is kind of a job in and of itself. You need to have like certain skills. And so you need to develop a strategy that's very effective. So what I want to do in this mini series is to provide you with a strategy that works for me for reading these kind of papers, and also to provide you with some tools to select papers that you may be interested in and also evaluate whether or not they may be more or less sound. Okay, so now let's get started from the first point, which is like the main problem that many people who read research papers first time encounter. And this is, I go to a paper, I'm super excited about the title, the idea, so I start reading, and after a few pages, I just find myself hitting a wall of text or mathematical formulas, and that can feel overwhelming, right? But the point is, it's totally okay to be scared. It's totally okay to be overwhelmed, and the reason is connected with the goal of a paper. So bear with me for a few seconds and I'll explain you why that's the case. So the goal of a paper is that of transferring cutting edge knowledge or cutting edge research. And so here already we are talking about cutting edge research, and these are things that are not trivial. They are not of common knowledge. So it's complicated stuff. And so you need time to dig in and you'll encounter things that you don't know. Now, moving on, if we just move on to the subsequent point here, we see that not only we want to transfer cutting edge research, but these papers are written by experts and they are for other experts, right? So the tone of voice, the tone of the writing is by experts for experts. And now, when I'm talking about experts here, I should qualify what I mean, right? It's not the case that if you are like an AI engineer, AI audio engineer, you can read all papers in AI audio without any issues, right? Papers are very specific. And so when I say that these papers are written by experts for experts, what I'm really saying is that they're written by experts in a subdomain for other experts in the same subdomain. So for example, when I read, my kind of research, my research interests are mainly in AI music, generative music, this kind of stuff. So when I read a paper in speech recognition, for example, it's not only the case that I can just easily read through all of that. I need to do, there are many things that I really don't know, and I have to do extra research to understand what the author is trying to tell me. Okay, so all of this to say that it's totally fine if you feel overwhelmed by a paper. Now, feeling overwhelmed is one thing, then not being able to understand the paper is another thing. And I think you have to have a specific strategy to overcome this feeling of being overwhelmed and actually understand all the complexity that comes with a paper. Now, I'll give you an example of what definitely doesn't work when you read a paper, right? And this is a strategy that I've seen employed all the time by people who read papers for the first time. And the idea is okay, so I'll just read a paper in one go from top to bottom with all of its details. Well, this is the perfect recipe for being overwhelmed and not really understanding what a paper has to say, because you are trying to internalize all of the complexity, all of the details in one go, and that's kind of too much really to take in. So there is another way of reading papers that's way more convenient and way more effective. And for understanding why that's the case, we should talk about the structure of a paper. And here I really like to use an analogy with food, with onions. So you can think of a paper just like as an onion. An onion has many layers. So the outermost like layers, and then you can dig in until you get into like the innermost layer, right? And this is something that you also have in a paper. So you can think of a paper as having many different layers, from the outermost layers, which is probably just the title, to the innermost layer, which is like all the details, code, and implementation details, right? Now, when you have a structure like this, then what makes sense is to have a strategy that follows this idea of like the multi layers and understanding a paper just layer by layer. And this is like the kind of approach that I've been using for reading papers for quite a long time. And this is just like this works for me, and it's been working now probably for 15 years, something like that. And it's something also like that I read that many other researchers and engineers use, kind of like variations like of this strategy like all the time. Okay, so let me share like this approach. So you'll see that I'll represent it into like 4 different steps and graphically, visually as a pyramid. Okay, so let's get started from the top of this pyramid. So the first step is that of skimming. So you want to skim through the paper real quick. Now, I'm going to get into the details of each of these 4 steps like in the coming part of this video. So here I'll just give you an overview. So first point, just skim quickly through the paper to get an idea of what the authors are talking about and what are like their solutions. Then once you've done like this first read, the second step is that of like fill in the details. You just like start reading through the paper and start taking notes about like all the different details and implementation details. Third point, you should start question everything. Start a conversation, a virtual intellectual conversation with the paper, and just like try to work out the problem once again for yourself. And finally, if we're talking about an implementation paper that has, I don't know, like a new AI music system, a new generative music system, and the code is available, just go and check out the code or try to re-implement the code. So yeah, these are all the 4 steps. And as you can see, like we are moving from a level that's way like higher, it's on the surface. And at each iteration, we dig deeper. Okay, so now let's take a look at each of these 4 steps in isolation and let's dig into them. So first point, skimming. So when we are skimming a paper, so we should be able to, by the end of this process, we should be able to answer these questions. So first one, what problem does the paper tackle? So what's the main topic of the paper? Second, what solutions does the paper offer? Third, what are the key findings and contributions? So in a nutshell, so what you want to do is get an idea of the topic of the paper, the solution that's offered, and the contributions, the findings. So how valuable that solution provided by the authors actually is. Okay, so, but for understanding how we can actually go through like the skimming process in details, we need to understand about the structure of a paper. And what's usually the case is that papers have a conventional structure. It's quite stereotyped. So you'll find sections that more or less tend to be there all the time. And this conventional structure is there because it makes communication easier, because it just relies on things that you know and you would expect. And so you already know as a reader, as an experienced reader, where to find the information throughout all the different sections. Okay, so now let's take a look at these sections one by one. So the probably the most important one that you have when you just like approach a paper for the first time is the abstract. And here you have information, general information about the paper. So what's the topic? What are like the solutions offered, the main contributions? Sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not, but the abstract is like the first 200 to 150 words that you should read through to get an initial idea of the paper. And then you have like the full body of the paper with all of the different sections. So here I'm listing the ones that I feel like are the most recurrent. So we start with the introduction. So in the introduction, the authors provide you with context, usually with context about like what they are talking about, and they start to discuss a little bit of the background and the related works and the problems that they want to tackle. Then moving on, you usually have a section that's called related works. Sometimes it can be called literature review or background. And there you have a little bit like of the state of the art of what's been done for that specific problem, right? So if you're dealing with, I don't know, like music genre classification, so you'll get references to other works in the space and how other researchers have approached the problem. Then you move on to methods. Now in methods, if we're talking about like an implementation paper, so with a new system, so most of the time you'll get the system itself, so the architecture of the system and how the system has been designed and implemented. So here you get all the details about the system. Then if we are talking about like an implementation paper, then a very important part of it is going to be the evaluation process. And evaluation is most of the time done through some kind of experiments. And so you'll probably find in this type of papers an experiment section. It could be experiment or experiment design or something like that. And the content there is just like providing you with information about the experiments and how the researchers have set up the experiments to evaluate the systems that they proposed in a paper. And then once you have this section, the natural continuation is a results section where the researchers provide you with data about the experiments and all the results. And so there you'll find figures, you'll find tables and comparisons perhaps between like the proposed system with other systems as baselines, just like to see if like the proposed system like is doing better like than the other ones, right? And sometimes like you also get after the results section, the discussion section. And in the discussion section, the authors kind of like take a higher look at the results. And so they discuss insights that may come out from the results, and they can propose possible applications for the system that they introduced and things like that. So this is like a higher level perspective on the results. And finally, you usually get a conclusion, which is a kind of like wrap up section where you get a quick summary of what the author did, what they proposed, the solution, the problem, and here they tend to stress quite a lot the contributions, the findings, and possible future research, avenues for research, as well as possible applications. Okay, so this is kind of like the stereotypical article that you'll get. But obviously, when you are like in the real world, you'll notice that not all the papers have this structure, or they may have like certain sections that follow like this stereotypical structure, but then they may have completely different ones. But all in all, like this is more or less what you should expect from AI papers, or at least like papers which provide new implementations or new systems like this. Okay, so all of this to say that when you are skimming, you don't want to focus on all of the paper, but rather select a few sections that are extremely important to answer those questions that we discussed about. So what's the topic, what's the solution, and what are like the key findings? And those sections are introduction, abstract, and conclusion. So what I suggest you to do during skimming is to first of all read the abstract, then go through the introduction and the conclusion. And in the process, you should also check out figures and tables, because figures and tables most of the time have a lot of useful information that you can get very, very quick. So you can see, for example, the architecture of a system that's been provided, or you can see in a nutshell, like the comparison of a system when it's been kind of like compared against other systems to see which one of the different systems compared is performing best. But the main point of skimming is that you really want to ignore the details. So you don't want to focus on the details. And that's because the whole point of skimming is just getting an overview, an idea of what it's going to be, like this paper. Okay, so what's the main goal of skimming then? Well, at the end of skimming, so you should be able to respond to this question. Do I care? Do I care about this paper enough to move on? And so here, if you say, yes, I really care, I think like this is a paper that's very interesting and I want to dig in, so you go on to step 2. If not, you just leave it at that, and that's totally fine. So let me give you an example here. So last week I was attending ISMIR. So ISMIR is the most important conference on music information retrieval. So there we had hundreds of papers, really. And so it was impossible to read all of them in real time. So what I did was doing a lot of skimming. And so by doing skimming, I was able to kind of get an idea and a sense of the different papers there. And I was able to select the ones that I wanted to dig in at a different time, or just like to follow like the poster sessions or paper sessions or whatever, right? So you can use skimming also as a way to quickly stay up to date with the research that's been output like every week there, right? Okay, so this is about skimming. Now let's move on to the second step. So we skim through the paper, we realize that we really want to deepen our understanding of the paper. So now we need to go to step 2, which is read the details. Okay, so in read the details, we want to answer to all of these questions here. So what's the state of the art of the problem? So what are like other solutions that have been proposed? Then we want to understand what are like the tools and techniques used by the authors. And then we want to start understanding how the authors evaluated their solution. So understanding like the experiments that they put into place to evaluate what they propose. And obviously, we also want to understand the results of those experiments. So is this system kind of like improving on what the state of the art is already doing? Or is it just like another way of doing like the same thing, but getting like more or less like the same results, right? So we really, really want to dig into the details and fill in all of this knowledge and answer to these questions. But how do we do that? Well, here we can go back to the prototypical structure of a paper. And when we read the details, what we should do is reading through all of these sections very carefully and giving us time to digest all of the complexity that comes with the details in all of these sections. So we'll read through the related works to understand what's the state of the art in the problem. We carefully read through the methods to understand the proposed solution, and then we'll move on to experiments and results to get an idea of how the authors evaluated the the introduced system, and also like to understand how well the proposed system does. And that's the same thing that we'll do on a higher level, or we'll get by reading the discussion section. Okay, so at this point, we can move on to step 3. But before we move to step 3, we should always ask the same question, which is, do I really care, right? Do I really care to spend more time on this paper? And if the answer is yes, then you'll move on to step number 3, which is question everything. And as you'll see here, we are getting even deeper into the paper. So in this step, what we want to answer are these 3 questions. So do I understand everything the authors say? Is the paper sound? What would have I done differently, right? So here we want to have a critical take on the paper. First of all, we want to just like think about all the different concepts and ideas that are in the paper and just realize whether we really understand everything. Then we want to question whether a paper is sound, and then just like work out the problem ourselves and try to understand what we would do differently than what the authors did in their paper. Okay, so I want to just like focus for a second on the first question here. Do I understand everything the authors say? Because it's often the case that you won't understand everything the authors say. So you'll need to find a way of kind of like just like getting like the knowledge that you need to understand all the points and all the concepts proposed in the paper. So how do we do that? So if there's something that we don't know and we can't just like know it through the paper itself, so how do we acquire that knowledge? Well, there are many ways you can do that. So first of all, just go on to Wikipedia, and there you'll find like more like kind of like beginner friendly explanations of like complex concepts. And at the same time, you can just search for blogs or YouTube videos that introduce a concept. And most of the time there, the concepts are introduced in a way more beginner friendly manner. And that's because while in a paper, you're talking about experts talking to other experts, on Wikipedia, on blogs and YouTube videos, well, the entry level is usually like lower, so you can really understand all of these concepts. And then once you have an idea, you can go back to the paper and see if now you can understand all of the arguments and ideas that kind of bleed from that initial concept. Another way to get a grasp of like things that you don't understand is to read textbooks. And the reason why you should do that is because textbooks are going to give you a whole background, that probably you'll need to understand many of the things that you're reading like in a paper. So let me explain this point better. So in a paper, so we're like authors usually like focus on a specific topic, and they assume that you already know a bunch of things, okay? In a textbook, the assumptions are completely different. So you have an author that's talking to an audience that's not necessarily an expert in that field or subfield. And so the author is going to introduce all of the ideas in a more beginner-friendly way, and it's going to give you a kind of comprehensive fundamentals that then you can use to deepen your knowledge even more. So if you feel you're reading a paper and you really don't understand most of it, then probably you'll have to understand like what are like the main topics there, and just refer back to a strong textbook. Another option that you have to get a better idea of what the paper is about and all of the concepts that are in there is to read survey papers or survey-like papers. So in these papers, you usually have a survey of the most important state-of-the-art techniques or technologies or systems for a specific problem. And there, not only like you'll get familiar with the state of the art and all of the different approaches proposed over time by different researchers, but also most of the time you'll also get all the concepts and basic ideas that you need to understand in order to get a grasp of the topic itself. So yeah, these survey papers are really a good way into a problem. Now, another option that you have to just like get knowledge about something that you don't know in a paper is just to ask a colleague. It may well be that a colleague of yours already knows the answer. So just like talk to colleagues. And and another and final option that you have is to join the Sound of AI community, which is a community where you'll find AI audio and AI music people and people interested like in these topics. And so if you're reading through like these kind of papers and you feel you're a little bit lost, you can go to my community, the Sound of AI community on Slack, and there you can just like post your questions and get feedback from people who are more experienced than you. And hopefully when you get more experience, you can just give back to the community. So if you're interested in signing up, just check the sign up link in the description box below. Okay, so now moving on. So what are like the techniques that you should use when we are in at this step? So question everything. So what I would suggest you doing is reading the referenced research papers. Most of the time, a paper is built on many other papers. So what you want to do really is to just like read all the different reference papers. Well, not all of them, because sometimes you may have 50 or 60 papers that are like reference, but like the main ones or the ones like that catch your attention the most. And so that is going to give you like a way better understanding of the paper that you are currently reading. Now, when you read these other papers, well, perhaps you can just like skim through them, right? So you just like go up to step 1 of this strategy that I'm talking about here, right? And so in that way, you'll get an idea, and those ideas are going to help you very much understanding the current paper you're reading, better. Okay, then after you've done that, another point here is just like to internalize the math, right? So you really need to understand the mathematical details provided in a paper. And this is like the point where you want to play around with the math and just like question all the formulas and all the ideas proposed through mathematical formalization by the authors. And then another point that I think is essential is the third one. So rethink the problem, work out the problem by yourself. So what would you do differently? So how would you construct the arguments? So reading through like the whole paper. So how would you construct the arguments in a different manner? So do you feel like the authors like are sound in their approach, or would you do like something different? And if so, what would you do differently, right? And finally, I think like this final point is extremely important. So you should try to explain the paper that you've just analyzed to a friend or to colleagues. And the reason why you should do that is because the moment you are able to explain a paper to other people, it means that you really own that paper, right? So this is an exercise that it's super important to do. Good. Okay, so now we are moving on to the fourth and final step. At this point, still, you'll have to ask the same question. So at the end of step 3, do I really, really, really care about this paper? And if the answer is yes, then you need to move on to step 4, which is checking the code. So now, most of the time, you'll have implementation code along with a paper. And if that's the case, you should just like check the author's implementation as the first thing. And most of the time, these are like repos that are on GitHub that you can pull and then just like check out. In other situations, you want to go like the extra mile. So perhaps you want to re-implement the proposed solution. And that exercise is going to give you like an extremely powerful way of understanding what like the system is all about, because you actually have to code it to implement it. And this is something that I highly suggest that if you are like really digging into like a certain topic, try to re-implement the code and then try to run experiments with that code in order to replicate the results that the authors had. But once again, this is something that you want to do if you're really, really interested in that topic and you have a lot of like time to spend. Okay, so let's try to wrap up this video going through like the 4-step approach once again. So you start by skimming the paper. So you quickly read through the abstract, the introduction, and the conclusion to get an idea of the problem, the solution, and the key findings there. Then if you're not satisfied with that and you want to dig in more, then you go to step 2, which is reading through the details. So basically you'll read through the whole body of the paper, getting like all the different details. Now, if you want to dig even more, you move to step number 3, which is questioning everything. And at this point, you really want to work out the solution and the problem for yourself and just like ask critique the paper, asking what would I do differently? Does everything work in a manner that's satisfying? Okay. And then if you want to go the extra mile, you'll check out the code and perhaps you'll re-implement it and run experiments. Now, one thing that I want to stress here before dashing off is that each of these points and each of these steps is going to take you some substantial time, and the deeper you want to dig and the more time you'll need to spend on that problem. So this is why it's very important to understand which papers to focus on. So there's a lot of research production that gets output every week in our field, in AI audio, AI music. So you want to have a strategy to understand what papers are the most promising and what are like the things that you may be the most interested in. And so, in the next video, what I want to do is give you a few tips and some advice regarding how you can choose papers and understand whether it's likely that there'll be like sound papers, good papers. And so it's worth spending your time on those. Okay, that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed the video and you found it useful. If that's the case, please hit the like button. And if you want to watch more videos like this, please consider subscribing to the Sound of AI channel. And I guess I'll see you next time. Cheers.